Outpost 44 was a miserable place to live. It sat on a cold, ash-covered rock called Tartarus 9. The sky was always gray, and the air smelled like rust and heavy industrial bleach. The planet belonged to a giant company called Apex Biosolutions. They didn't care about the workers, and they didn't care about safety. They only cared about profit. They brought dangerous alien creatures from the deep jungle areas of the planet into the sub-level labs to study them, cut them open, and steal their genetic secrets. Caleb was not a scientist. He was not a corporate executive wearing a clean gray suit. Caleb was a sanitation engineer. That was just a fancy name for a janitor. He was the guy who wore heavy steel-toed boots, a stained gray uniform, and held a high-pressure hose. His job was simple but awful. He had to clean the blood and slime out of the holding pens after the scientists were done with their cruel experiments. It was a lonely, thankless job. The guards looked down on him, and the scientists treated him like he was invisible. But Caleb just kept his head down, did his job, and tried to earn enough money to someday leave this terrible rock. One Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. Caleb was standing in the loading bay, leaning against his mop, when the heavy steel doors hissed open. A retrieval team marched in, looking pale and terrified. They were dragging a massive metal cage. Inside the cage was the body of a female night stalker. Even though she was dead, she looked like a nightmare. She looked like a giant wolf mixed with a deep-sea crab. She had 6 muscular legs, jagged black armor plates covering her body, and a mouth that could unhinge to show rows of translucent, razor-sharp teeth. But she wasn't the reason the guards were shaking. Beneath the female's armored chest plate, there was a small pouch. Inside that pouch, 4 tiny shapes were moving. They were her cubs. Dar. Collins, the lead scientist of the facility, walked into the bay. He didn't look sad about the dead mother. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looked at the moving pouch, and smiled a cold, clinical smile. "Isolate the offspring immediately," Dr. Collins ordered, his voice flat and heartless. "Put them in Pen 9. Do not give them any food. I want to study their baseline aggression. Let's see how long they last before they turn on each other." Caleb watched as the guards used heavy robotic arms to pull the 4 small creatures out of the pouch. They were about the size of medium-sized earthly dogs, covered in dark, soft scales that looked like obsidian. Their eyes were a strange, milky blue color. Even though they were babies, they didn't look cute. They snapped their tiny secondary jaws and hissed, thick yellow acid dripping from their mouths and sizzling against the metal floor. The guards threw them into Pen 9, locked the reinforced glass door, and left. For the next 4 days, Outpost 44 became a living hell. The cubs didn't cry like normal animals. They made a sound that was half hiss and half mechanical grinding. It was a loud, constant, scraping whine that traveled through the ventilation pipes and echoed into the crew quarters. It dug into the base of Caleb's skull. It made his teeth ache. Nobody could sleep. The guards were furious, and the scientists just ignored it, writing down notes on their digital tablets. By the 5th night, Caleb couldn't take it anymore. He hadn't slept a full night in a week. He told himself he was just being practical. He just wanted the damn things to shut up so he could get a few hours of rest. He waited until midnight, when the second shift security guards rotated out for their break. The corridors were dark and quiet, lit only by the dull yellow emergency bulbs. Caleb bypassed the lower-level inventory locks, a small trick he had learned from an old maintenance worker, and hauled a 20-gallon plastic bucket down the long, cold hallway toward Pen 9. Inside the bucket was a thick, gray sludge. It was a mix of discarded synthetic protein paste and leftover food from the mess hall. It looked like wet cement and smelled faintly of wet cardboard, but it was full of calories. When Caleb reached the thick reinforced glass of Pen 9, the noise stopped instantly. 4 pairs of milky blue eyes locked onto him through the dark. The cubs were shivering from hunger, their ribs showing through their small armor plates. The moment they saw Caleb, they threw themselves against the glass. The impact made the heavy frame shake. They opened their mouths, showing their tiny, sharp teeth, ready to fight for their lives. Caleb stood there, holding the heavy bucket, looking at the four little nightmares. "Back off," Caleb muttered, his voice echoing in the empty, cold corridor. He felt ridiculous talking to alien predators, but the silence of the sublevels was heavy and scary. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just get back." He didn't open the main door. He wasn't stupid. Instead, he used the automated feeding trough built into the wall. He dumped the heavy gray sludge into the metal hopper and hit the release valve. The trough slid smoothly into the pen. The cubs didn't hesitate. They attacked the food with a violent, terrifying desperation. The four cubs ate like monsters. They snarled and pushed each other out of the way, their secondary jaws snapping aggressively as they buried their faces in the thick gray sludge. It was a chaotic, messy sight. Caleb stood on the safe side of the reinforced glass, resting his arms on the metal railing. He watched them with a mix of disgust and pity. The terrible, grinding whine that had kept the entire outpost awake for days had finally stopped. The only sound left in the dark corridor was the wet, frantic noise of four starving babies eating their first real meal. As Caleb turned to pick up his empty plastic bucket, he noticed something. The smallest cub, the runt of the group, had been pushed to the back by its larger siblings. It had a small piece of its left ear plate missing, probably from a fight over space inside the cage. It was smaller, thinner, and its blue eyes looked cloudy with exhaustion. The little creature gave up on the crowd around the food trough. Instead, it slowly padded over to the glass, right where Caleb was standing. It didn't throw itself against the window this time. It just sat down on its 6 legs, tilted its heavy, wedge-shaped head, and looked up at Caleb. "Don't look at me like that, ugly," Caleb whispered into the quiet hallway. "I only did this so I could get some sleep. Tomorrow, the scientists will probably figure out a new way to torment you." The cub didn't move. Its tiny mandibles clicked softly. Then, a strange sound started coming from deep inside its chest. It wasn't a hiss, and it wasn't a growl. It was a low, heavy, vibrating sound. It sounded exactly like a diesel engine idling in the distance. Caleb blinked in surprise. A purr. He thought, a small smile breaking through his tired face. Yeah, well, don't get used to it. But Caleb was lying to himself. The next night, at exactly the same time, he found himself sneaking back down to the inventory room. He filled another heavy bucket with the synthetic protein sludge, avoided the security cameras, and marched down to Pen 9. This time, the cubs didn't attack the glass when he approached. They didn't make a sound. They were sitting perfectly still in a neat row, their 6 legs tucked neatly under their armored bodies. Their 4 pairs of blue eyes tracked his heavy steel-toed boots as he walked up to the hopper. They had learned the sound of his footsteps. For 2 weeks, Caleb ran his secret soup kitchen for the most dangerous predators on Tartarus 9. He began to notice their different personalities. The largest female was clearly the leader. She was aggressive, smart, and always demanded to eat first. Caleb cynically named her Princess. The small runt with the broken ear plate was the most observant. He didn't rush into things, he watched and calculated. Caleb named him Buster. The other 2 were chaotic and wild, constantly chewing on the metal edges of the pen, so Caleb grouped them together as Scrap and Hazard. Over those 14 days, the cubs underwent a massive growth spurt. The high-protein corporate sludge was packed with growth stimulants, and without the stress of starvation, their bodies expanded rapidly. They grew from the size of medium dogs to the size of large wolves. Their soft scales hardened into thick, overlapping plates of obsidian armor that reflected the dim yellow lights of the corridor. Their teeth grew longer, and the acid dripping from their mouths became so corrosive that it began to score and stain the reinforced floor plates of their pen. Yet, every time Caleb approached, they sat in absolute silence, waiting for their alpha, the man with the food, to slide the trough inside. "You guys are growing too fast," Caleb murmured one night, watching Princess easily swallow a massive chunk of protein paste. "If Colin sees you like this, he's going to know someone is messing with his experiment. I can't keep this up forever." Princess paused her eating. She lifted her massive, heavy head and looked through the glass. She let out that deep, rumbling engine purr, and a second later, Buster, Scrap, and Hazard joined in. The combined vibration was so strong it literally shook the glass and sent a warm hum through the soles of Caleb's boots. It was a strange, secret bond. To the rest of the facility, these creatures were level 9 biohazards, nightmares wrapped in razor wire and acid. But to Caleb, they were just 4 hungry kids trapped in a terrible place, just like him. Unfortunately, Caleb's secret routine was about to come to a sudden, painful halt. On the 15th day, while hosing down an old extraction lab in Sector 4, Caleb's foot slipped on a patch of slick chemical residue. As he reached out to catch his balance, his bare forearm scraped hard against the sharp, jagged edge of a rusted containment grate. It wasn't a deep cut, just a nasty scratch that drew a thin line of blood. He wiped it on his uniform, ignored the slight stinging pain, and finished his shift. He didn't know that the rusted grates in Sector 4 were covered in active spores of a deadly local infection known as trench rot. By the time Caleb returned to his small, cramped crew quarters that evening, his arm was hot to the touch. A deep, throbbing ache began to creep up his spine. He tried to ignore it, drinking a cup of stale water and lying down on his narrow cot, but by midnight, his body was shaking violently with a sudden, freezing chill. He didn't have the strength to haul the bucket down to Pen 9 that night. He could barely lift his head from the synthetic pillow. The next morning, Caleb dragged himself to the facility infirmary. The company doctor, a sharp-featured, cold man named Collins, who handled both the science labs and basic employee health, didn't even look up from his data tablet as Caleb stumbled in. "It's a mild strain of trench rot," Dr. Collins said, his voice dripping with clinical detachment. He didn't offer Caleb a seat. "The spores have entered your bloodstream. Standard procedure. Can I get a dose of the med gel?" Caleb rasped, his throat feeling like sandpaper. "The fever is really bad." Collins finally looked up, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "Med gel is expensive, Caleb. It is reserved for essential laboratory personnel and executives. You are a sanitation worker. I will prescribe a course of generic broad-spectrum antibiotics. You are confined to your quarters for the next 72 hours to prevent spore contamination in the clean zones. Go back to your room." Caleb wanted to scream, but he didn't have the energy. He took the small packet of cheap pills, stumbled back down the long, metallic hallways, and collapsed onto his hard mattress. As the hours dragged on, the fever burned hotter and hotter. His mind became cloudy, filled with strange, distorted nightmares. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his sweat soaking through his gray uniform. Through the haze of his failing mind, Caleb kept thinking about Pen 9. "It's been 2 days," his feverish brain whispered. "They haven't eaten. They're going to starve. Or worse. They're going to turn on each other." He lay there in the dark, shivering under his thin blanket, completely helpless, listening to the dull, steady hum of the Outpost's ventilation system. He had no idea that down in the sublevels, 4 pairs of milky blue eyes were staring at an empty feeding trough, listening for a set of heavy steel-toed boots that never arrived. Caleb's room felt like a small, metal oven. The mattress on his narrow cot was made of a cheap synthetic sponge that managed to be both painfully hard and entirely unsupportive. The tiny room smelled like industrial bleach, old sweat, and the metallic tang of recycled air pumped sluggishly through the rusted vents. Caleb coughed, a dry, rattling sound that tore at his throat, and stared up at the ceiling. Tartarus 9 was not a planet that forgave mistakes. It was a miserable place, and right now, Caleb felt like he was paying the ultimate price for just living on it. His joints ached with a deep, throbbing heat. The fever had been creeping up his spine for 3 days now, the result of that careless scratch in Sector 4. The generic, cheap antibiotics Dr. Collins had given him were completely useless. They did nothing to stop the alien spores multiplying in his blood. Every time Caleb tried to sit up, the room spun wildly, and a wave of nausea forced him back down onto his damp pillow. He was completely alone. In a corporate facility like Outpost 44, there was no sick leave, and there were no friends to check on you. If you couldn't do your job, you didn't exist. The maintenance crew was viewed with the same clinical detachment Dr. Collins reserved for his lab rats. Caleb knew that if his heart stopped beating, the company would simply delete his employee file, hose out his room, and hire a new janitor from the next supply ship. As the hours blurred together, Caleb's mind began to wander into strange, sweaty delirium. He lost track of day and night. But no matter how confused his brain became, his thoughts kept drifting back to the sublevels. Specifically, to Pen 9. It had been nearly 72 hours since he last fed the cubs. In his fever dreams, he could hear them. He imagined them pacing back and forth along the reinforced glass, their claws clicking sharply against the steel floor grates. He imagined Princess standing by the empty hopper, her 4 blue eyes staring down the dark corridor, waiting for the man who brought the gray sludge. He imagined Buster, the runt, shivering in the corner, growing weaker by the hour. A deep sense of guilt settled in Caleb's chest. He had started feeding them just to get some sleep, but now he realized he had made them dependent on him. They didn't know how to survive in a lab without his secret help. Dar. Collins wanted them to starve to study their aggression, and by falling sick, Caleb was letting the cruel scientist win. "I'm sorry, guys," Caleb muttered into the empty room, his voice a cracked whisper. "I can't get up. I just can't." On the third afternoon, the physical pain reached its peak. A sharp, violent cramp seized Caleb's stomach, pulling his knees up to his chest. He curled into a tight ball on the mattress, burying his face in his hands. His skin felt tight, dry, and incredibly hot. He was burning from the inside out. The dark void of unconsciousness felt like it was pulling him under, and a terrifying thought crossed his mind: I am going to die in this room. Then, the lights flickered. The dull yellow bulb on Caleb's ceiling sputtered twice, dimmed into a faint orange glow, and completely died. For a long, silent moment, the room was pitched into total, absolute darkness. The steady, comforting hum of the ventilation system cut out, leaving the air heavy and still. Caleb blinked through the dark, trying to force his heavy eyelids open. "Great," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "Generator maintenance. Just what I need." But it wasn't maintenance. A second later, the emergency backup power kicked in. The small room was instantly bathed in a harsh, strobing crimson light. The red panels along the baseboards began to flash rhythmically, casting long, bloody shadows across the walls. Before Caleb could even process the change in light, the automated sirens began to wail. It was a high-pitched, undulating screech that penetrated the thick steel walls of the crew block. It was a sound every employee at Outpost 44 feared. "We-oh! We-oh!" A cold spike of adrenaline shot through Caleb's veins, cutting through his fever haze like a knife. He knew that specific alarm. It wasn't a fire drill, and it wasn't an atmospheric storm warning. It was a Class A containment breach. Something dangerous had escaped from the labs. Through the heavy bulkhead door of his quarters, sensory details began to filter into his room. The usually quiet, monotonous crew sector was suddenly chaotic. He smelled smoke drifting through the dead ventilation grate above his bed. It wasn't the sweet smell of burning wood or the acrid tang of an electrical fire. It was the heavy, chemical stench of vaporized metal and burning synthetic flooring. Then came the sounds. They were muffled by the thick iron doors, but they were unmistakable. He heard the rapid, staccato crack of corporate-issue pulse rifles. He heard heavy security boots thudding against the metal corridors in a wild, chaotic sprint. And then, he heard a human scream. It started high, filled with pure terror, and was cut abruptly, violently short. Caleb's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his mattress, his fingers trembling. The room spun wildly as he tried to sit up, but the adrenaline kept him from collapsing. The battle outside was moving down the hall, away from the research labs and directly into the living quarters. The security team was retreating, and whatever was hunting them was winning. The gunfire began to fade, replaced by a sound that made Caleb's heart stop completely. It was a rhythmic, terrifying clatter. The sound of dozens of industrial scythes being dragged across a metal grate. Claws. Massive, heavy claws on reinforced steel. They were right outside his door. The clattering sound outside the door grew louder and sharper. It sounded like dozens of heavy metal blades scratching against the deck plating. Caleb lay perfectly still on his cot, holding his breath. His chest felt like it was on fire, but he didn't dare make a sound. The heavy gunfire from the corporate security squad had completely died out. The silence that followed was much worse, broken only by the rhythmic, terrifying scrape of those massive claws and the harsh, mechanical wail of the crimson emergency siren. They got out, Caleb realized, a wave of pure terror washing over him. The Night Stalkers broke out of the sublevels. His fever-warped brain tried to calculate the danger. When he had last seen them 3 days ago, the 4 cubs were already the size of wolves, packing dense muscle and heavy obsidian armor plates. If they had been entirely without food since his illness began, their hypermetabolic alien bodies would be driven by absolute desperation. They would be starving, highly aggressive, and hunting for anything made of meat. The heavy clattering footfalls stopped right outside the threshold of cell 42. Caleb stared at the thick iron handle of his door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Please, he thought, staring intensely into the pulsing red light of the room. Keep walking. Go down the hall. Go find Dr. Collins. He's the one who wanted to see what happens when you starve. From the other side of the bulkhead, a low, vibrating snarl echoed through the metal. It was a deep, guttural sound that Caleb felt in his chest rather than heard with his ears. It was the sound of a predator sensing prey. Then, something slammed into the door. Boom! The violent impact shook the entire frame. Dust, rust flakes, and bits of old insulation rained down from the ceiling, dusting Caleb's sweat-soaked face and uniform. The thick steel of the door groaned loudly under the pressure. A second impact followed immediately, heavier than the first. Crack! This time, it was accompanied by the sickening, high-pitched screech of metal tearing. The heavy automated locking mechanism squealed in protest as something incredibly strong began to deform the steel plate from the outside. Caleb tried to push himself backward, dragging his body away from the door toward the corner of his bed, but his weak legs refused to cooperate. They felt like lead weight. He looked around the small, empty room in a panic. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't even have a hydrospanner or a heavy tool to swing. He was completely trapped, unarmed, and too sick to put up a fight. He was going to be ripped apart in his own bed. With a final, catastrophic sound of shattering bolts, the reinforced hinges gave way. The door didn't just burst inward, it was systematically peeled open. Four sets of massive, sickle-shaped talons, slick with dark blue alien blood and dripping with smoking yellow acid, hooked around the edges of the thick steel frame. With a display of terrifying mechanical strength, the creatures hauled the metal panel backward, crumpling it like a piece of thin tin foil before throwing it loudly into the corridor outside. The dust cleared, and 4 massive shapes stood in the open doorway, framed by the pulsing red strobe lights of the hallway. Caleb choked back a gasp. They were much larger than he remembered. 3 weeks of eating the high-density corporate protein paste had fueled a massive, monstrous growth spurt. They weren't cubs anymore, they were young apex predators. Their obsidian armor plates were flared outward, making them look jagged, heavy, and massive. A thick cloud of steam rose from their biological furnace-like bodies, mixing with the sharp, overwhelming stench of ozone, copper, and raw carnage. Their muzzles were stained a deep, fresh crimson. Human blood. Princess, the largest female, took a heavy step into the small room. Her 4 milky blue eyes locked instantly onto Caleb's pale face. Her mandibles parted slightly, releasing a soft, clicking hiss as a long, dark tongue tasted the air. Behind her, Buster, Scrap, and Hazard crowded into the narrow space, completely blocking the exit. The temperature inside the tiny room spiked instantly, turning the space into a sweltering sauna from the intense body heat radiated by the monsters. Caleb couldn't move. He couldn't even find his voice to scream. He just lay there, staring into the dark face of death, waiting for the final, fatal pounce. He waited for those razor-sharp translucent teeth to sink into his chest. Princess closed the distance between the doorway and the bed in 2 slow, heavy steps. The metal floor plates groaned beneath her immense weight. She loomed directly over the narrow cot, her massive wedge-shaped head hovering just inches above Caleb's chest. A thick drop of clear, heavy saliva pulled at the corner of her lower jaw, falling straight down to hit the thin blanket covering Caleb's shaking legs. Surprisingly, it didn't burn. It was just heavy and wet. She lowered her dark snout, sniffing his face with a loud, wet, snuffling sound that filled the room. She nudged his shoulder with her hard, chitinous nose, hard enough to leave a deep bruise through his uniform. Caleb let out a weak, pathetic groan. The fear was gone, replaced by the pure exhaustion of his failing body. "Just do it," he rasped, looking straight into her blue eyes. "Make it quick, ugly. I feel like absolute trash anyway." Princess didn't bite. Instead, her mandibles clicked closed, and she let out that deep, heavy, rumbling vibration from the center of her chest. Thrum thrum thrum. The diesel engine purr. She stepped awkwardly over Caleb's legs, her razor-sharp talons carefully avoiding his bare skin with a strange, deliberate precision, and curled her massive, heavy body at the very foot of his bed. The cheap mattress sagged dangerously under her weight, nearly touching the floor. Buster was next. The runt moved to the left side of the cot, pressing his heavily armored flank tightly against Caleb's shivering ribs. The heat radiating from his alien body was intense, burning right through the thin fabric of the gray uniform. Buster rested his heavy, jagged head directly on Caleb's chest, pinning him down against the mattress like a heavy safety blanket. The other 2 filled the remaining space. Scrap wedged himself tightly against Caleb's right side, while Hazard curled up on the floor directly beneath the bed, blocking the only avenue of approach with a solid wall of spiked obsidian armor. Within seconds, Caleb was entirely entombed in a mountain of coarse thermal fur, hardened chitin, and overwhelming heat. The scent of fresh blood and ozone was suffocating, making him gag weakly, but as the intense warmth of the 4 predators began to sink into his freezing skin, the violent shivering that had racked his body for days finally began to stop. The synchronized, grinding purr of the 4 monsters filled the room, creating a deep vibration that shook the entire bed frame. Caleb's mind began to slip back down into the dark void of unconsciousness, but as his eyes closed, his hand fell limply over the thick, rough neck armor of the killer resting against his chest. He wasn't terrified anymore. For the first time in 3 days, he was warm. The intense heat saved his life. The trench rot spores in Caleb's blood required a drop in body temperature to complete their deadly cycle. But the furnace-like warmth radiating from the 4 alien predators acted like a massive medical thermal blanket. It literally burned the infection right out of his system. When Caleb finally opened his eyes, the blinding haze of the fever was gone. His mind felt sharp and clear, though his muscles were stiff and sore. The harsh crimson emergency lights were still pulsing rhythmically in the corridor outside, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined doorway. He tried to shift his position, but he couldn't move an inch. Buster was still draped across his chest, his heavy obsidian head resting heavily right below Caleb's chin. The runt's 4 blue eyes were closed, his breathing deep and steady. On either side, Princess and Scrap formed a solid, heavy wall of black armor plating, pinning Caleb securely into the mattress. From beneath the cot, a low, rumbling snores from Hazard vibrated through the metal frame. They hadn't eaten him. They had incubated him. They had formed a living fortress around their sick handler. Suddenly, Buster's ears, 2 sharp, triangular plates on top of his head, snapped forward. His blue eyes flashed open, instantly wide and alert. A split second later, Princess and Scrap rose to their feet in a single, fluid motion, their claws clicking sharply against the floor. The peaceful, engine-like purring stopped instantly, replaced by a low, terrifying hiss that made the air in the small room feel incredibly tight. They heard something coming down the corridor. Caleb scrambled backward against the metal headboard, rubbing his sore chest. Through the shattered gap where his door used to be, he could hear the distinct sound of heavy, organized footsteps. This wasn't the chaotic panic of fleeing workers. This was a tactical squad. "Hold your fire on this sector," a loud, authoritative voice boomed through the hallway. It was Commander Mike, the head of Outpost 44's corporate security force. "We have a trail of blue blood leading into the crew quarters. The specimens are cornered in cell 42. "Remember, Commander," another voice chimed in, sharp, arrogant, and instantly recognizable. "Dr. Collins. The company has millions invested in these assets. Kill the wild ones if you must, but I want at least 2 intact for genetic harvesting. They are corporate property." "Sir, this is a crew block," Mike replied, his voice tense. "The janitor, Caleb, is assigned to this cell. He might still be inside." "A sanitation worker is easily replaceable, Commander," Collins snapped back coldly. "The data from these predators is not. Flashbangs first, then clear the room with heavy pulse fire." Caleb's blood ran cold. They weren't coming to rescue him. They were coming to liquidate the room, and he was just acceptable collateral damage to Apex Bio Solutions. Princess didn't wait for them to make the first move. She stepped forward, her massive 6-legged frame completely blocking the ruined doorway. Her body expanded, her heavy obsidian plates flaring out like a shield, turning her into a literal wall of living armor. Behind her, Scrap and Hazard flanked the opening, their secondary jaws unhinging to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth dripping with sizzling, yellow acid. Buster remained right at the foot of the bed, his body crouched low, his milky blue eyes locked onto Caleb, ready to spring if anyone bypassed the main line of defense. Movement in the doorway, a guard shouted from the corridor. "Light them up." Pop. Pop. 2 metal cylinders rolled through the gap, bouncing against the floor plates. They exploded in a blinding flash of white light and a deafening, high-pitched screech. It was a standard corporate tactical flashbang, designed to blind and disorient human targets. But the Night Stalkers didn't rely on normal human vision. Their milky blue eyes didn't even blink. Before the smoke could even clear from the explosion, the security team moved into position. 3 guards in heavy, matte black armor plates stepped into the hallway directly in front of the cell, their heavy pulse rifles raised and aimed at Princess's chest. "Fire!" Commander Mike ordered. A wall of brilliant blue plasma bolts erupted from the rifle barrels, slamming into Princess's front armor plates with a succession of loud, metallic cracks. The air instantly smelled like ozone and scorched chitin. The force of the heavy impact pushed the massive female back half a step, her claws digging deep furrows into the steel floor as she fought to maintain her ground. She let out a deafening, mechanical roar that shook the very dust from the ceiling, but she did not drop. The high-density protein sludge Caleb had fed her for weeks had done its job, her armor was too thick, too dense for standard security rounds to penetrate. "What the hell are these things?" a guard screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he watched his plasma rounds bounce harmlessly off her black chest plate. "They're too big. The files said they were just cubs. They're adapting." Dr. Collins shouted from the back of the line, his voice a mix of absolute terror and twisted scientific fascination. "Keep firing. Don't let them advance." Princess tilted her heavy, wedge-shaped head back. With a sudden, violent jerk of her neck muscles, she unleashed a thick torrent of bright yellow, smoking acid directly at the lead guard's heavy tactical shield. The highly corrosive liquid hit the reinforced polymer surface and dissolved it within 2 seconds, melting the thick shield like hot wax and sending the guard screaming to the floor as the acid began to eat through his boot armor. The tactical formation shattered instantly. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted. The narrow hallway outside cell 42 was a scene of absolute, fiery chaos. The lead guard was rolling on the floor, screaming in agony as the yellow acid hissed and chewed through his heavy boot armor. The other 2 guards were retreating in a panic, firing wild, blind bursts of blue plasma that punched holes into the ceiling and shattered the light fixtures, plunging the corridor back into a dim, strobing red darkness. "Fall back. Fall back to the bulkhead." Commander Mike roared over the noise, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and fear. He was dragging the injured guard backward by his tactical vest, his boots slipping on the slick, blood-stained floor. Princess stepped out of the ruined doorway, her 6 muscular legs moving with terrifying, silent precision. She looked like a demon made of solid obsidian, the smoke from the plasma burns rising off her unyielding armor plates. She didn't chase them down the hall immediately. Instead, she stood right in the center of the corridor, her massive frame completely blocking the path to Caleb's room. Inside the cell, Caleb finally found his feet. His knees were still slightly weak, but the fever was completely gone. He gripped the dented metal frame of the door and looked out into the smoky hallway. "Princess, hold!" Caleb shouted. The massive female paused. Her heavy, wedge-shaped head snapped back toward him, her 4 milky blue eyes narrowing. Her secondary jaws clicked softly, but she didn't move forward. She maintained her position, a living shield between the corporate security squad and her handler. Down the hall, behind the line of retreating guards, Dr. Collins was frantic. He was tapping furiously on his digital tablet, his face pale and covered in cold sweat. His expensive gray suit was stained with soot. "This is impossible," Collins hissed, his voice trembling with a dangerous mix of fear and greed. "Their growth charts shouldn't look like this for another 6 months. Someone altered their dietary intake. Someone fed them." Collins's eyes darted past Princess's massive bulk and locked directly onto Caleb, who was standing in the doorway of cell 42. The scientist's face twisted with immediate realization and pure rage. "You," Collins pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Caleb. "The janitor. It was you. You've been tampering with my multi-million-dollar research assets. You stole company protein paste." "I didn't tamper with anything, Doc," Caleb called out, his voice strong and steady. He stepped out into the hallway, standing right beside Princess. He rested his hand casually on her rough neck armor, and the massive beast instantly let out a low, vibrating purr that echoed through the metal corridor. "I just fed 4 starving babies because your cheap walls couldn't drown out their cries, and I wanted some damn sleep. But it turns out, they have better manners than anyone else on this corporate rock." "You idiot!" Collins screamed, stepping behind Commander Mike for protection. "They are not pets. They are engineered bioweapons owned by Apex Biosolutions. Commander, terminate the janitor for corporate espionage and asset sabotage. Shoot him." Commander Mike didn't raise his rifle. He looked at Caleb, then at the massive, unyielding form of Princess, and then at Buster, Scrap, and Hazard, who were now crawling out of the cell, their claws clicking sharply against the steel deck. The 4 predators stood in a tight, impenetrable formation around the young janitor, their bodies radiating a suffocating wave of heat and malice. With all due respect, Dr. Collins, Mike said, his voice tight as he slowly lowered his weapon. My men are bleeding out, and our plasma rifles are literally bouncing off their hides. If I order my squad to fire on that kid, those things will rip this entire sector apart before we can even reload. We are outmatched. I don't care about your men, Commander. Collins shouted, his corporate arrogance overriding his survival instincts. I care about the data. If we lose this facility, the board of directors will have our heads. Use the gas. Flood the entire sector with the neural toxin from the main command center. Commander Mike blinked, his face turning pale under his helmet. Sir, the neural gas is lethal to humans without full biosuits. The crew blocks don't have independent ventilation filters. If we flood this sector, every worker sleeping in these quarters will die in their beds. Then they die for the company's bottom line. Collins yelled, his eyes wild. He grabbed his tablet, bypassing the commander's authority. I am overriding the safety protocols from here. I am sealing the sector bulkheads. With a sharp, mechanical chime, the heavy blast doors at the far end of the corridor began to slide down. They were thick, airtight steel barriers designed to isolate biological hazards. Clang! The heavy doors slammed into the floor plates, sealing Caleb, the security squad, Dr. Collins, and the four monsters inside a long, tight, windowless metal tomb. From the ventilation grates above their heads, a faint, hissing sound began to echo. A thick, pale green vapor started to drift down into the red strobe lights of the hallway. The corporate toxin was entering the air. The pale green vapor drifted lazily down from the overhead vents, twisting in the pulsing crimson light of the emergency sirens. The smell hit Caleb a second later. It was sweet, like rotten fruit mixed with burning plastic. His lungs instantly burned, and he let out a harsh, racking cough, covering his nose and mouth with the sleeve of his gray uniform. Toxin level rising, an automated computer voice announced calmly over the intercom. Sector 4 isolation complete. 5 minutes until lethal saturation. Down the hall, the security guards were panicking. They didn't have full biosuits, just standard tactical helmets with basic dust filters. One guard collapsed to his knees, clutching his throat as he gasped for clean air. Collins, you crazy old bastard. Commander Mike choked out, slam-banging his heavy boot against the sealed steel blast doors. Open the override switch. You're killing us too. Dr. Collins didn't answer. He had already slipped through a small, secondary emergency escape hatch at the end of the hall, locking it tightly behind him. Caleb could see his cold, pale face through the small reinforced viewing port of the hatch. The scientist was safely on the other side of the glass, watching them with a dark, clinical curiosity. An unfortunate necessity, Commander, Collins's voice cracked through the corridor's wall speaker. The specimens must be neutralized, and the data must be preserved. Your sacrifice will be noted in the company's annual report. We're dead, Caleb muttered, his vision already starting to blur as the green gas filled the hallway. His knees buckled, and he sank against Princess's warm, armored side. Princess let out a sharp, panicked hiss. She looked up at the green vapor, then down at Caleb. Her 4 blue eyes narrowed with deep intelligence. She realized the air was making her handler weak. She turned her massive head toward the heavy steel blast doors, then back toward the small, narrow cell they had just left. She didn't try to fight the steel doors down the hall. Instead, she let out a short, high-pitched clicking bark, a tactical command. Buster, Scrap, and Hazard reacted instantly. They didn't run toward the guards or the escape hatch. They charged back inside cell 42, their 6 legs churning furiously against the deck plating. Princess hooked her massive jaw under Caleb's armpit, lifting his limp body off the floor with surprising gentleness, and dragged him back inside the tiny room. The air inside the cell was thick with smoke, but it was slightly clearer than the hallway. Buster was already standing at the very back of the room, staring at the solid, reinforced outer wall. Behind that thick composite wall was nothing but the open, freezing air of the planet Tartarus 9. What are you doing, boy? Caleb wheezed, his lungs screaming for oxygen. Princess dropped him onto the mattress. She stood beside Buster, her body tense, her muscles bunching tightly under her obsidian scales. Scrap and Hazard lined up right behind them, forming a heavy, synchronized battering ram. The Night Stalkers weren't just strong, they were biological excavators. In the deep jungles of their home planet, they dug through solid rock to create their underground nests. Acid. Caleb choked out, realizing their plan. Burn it first. Princess didn't need the instruction. She opened her secondary jaws wide and unleashed a massive, continuous stream of bright yellow, boiling acid directly onto the center of the back wall. The highly corrosive liquid hit the reinforced corporate alloys, and a violent reaction erupted. The wall hissed, bubbled, and began to melt away like hot butter, thick black smoke billowing into the room. The acid ate through the first 3 layers of insulation, exposing the heavy structural support beams. Before the acid could even stop sizzling, Princess and Buster launched themselves forward. Boom! The impact of their combined weight, nearly 2 tons of dense muscle and hardened chitin, slammed into the weakened structure. The entire crew block groaned and tilted slightly. A massive crack ripped through the composite wall, letting in a sudden, violent blast of freezing, ash-filled air from the outside planet. Again. Caleb screamed, coughing violently as the green gas from the hallway began to spill into the cell. Hit it again. Scrap and Hazard roared, lower jaws unhinging as they added their own weight to the assault. They struck the fractured wall like a pair of mechanical pistons. Crack shatter. The solid back wall of cell 42 completely exploded outward. A massive shower of concrete chunks, twisted metal rebar, and insulation foam rained down onto the cold, gray ash fields outside. The sudden change in atmospheric pressure created a violent wind tunnel, sucking the deadly green vapor out into the freezing night air of Tartarus 9. Caleb lay on the bed, gasping deeply, filling his burning lungs with the cold, crisp, albeit sulfur-smelling air of the planet. It felt like heaven. Through the massive, jagged hole in the wall, Caleb looked out into the dark, desolate landscape of the ash flats. The storm outside was howling, but they were free. The corporate cage was broken. Princess turned her heavy head toward him, her blue eyes shining in the dark. She let out a soft, inviting purr, then stepped through the broken wall, disappearing into the dark shadows of the canyon outside. Buster, Scrap, and Hazard followed her, their dark bodies blending perfectly with the black volcanic rocks. Caleb smiled weakly, dragging his sore body toward the edge of the shattered floor plate. He looked back at the empty, dark corridor of the corporate facility, then out at the wild, dangerous freedom of the alien planet. He knew exactly what he had to do. The cold wind of Tartarus 9 howled through the massive, jagged hole in the wall, scattering gray ash across the floor of cell 42. Outside, the planet was dark, wild, and unforgiving. Inside, the green lethal gas had completely cleared, sucked out into the atmosphere. Caleb sat on the edge of the broken floor plating, looking down at the 5-foot drop into the ash fields. Down below, in the dark shadows of the volcanic rocks, 4 pairs of glowing blue eyes were staring back up at him. They were waiting. They weren't running away, they were waiting for their alpha to lead them. Suddenly, a weak, coughing sound came from the ruined doorway behind him. Caleb turned around. Commander Mike was dragging himself into the room, his tactical helmet gone, his face pale and covered in sweat. He had managed to survive the gas by breathing through a damp piece of cloth. He looked at the shattered back wall, then at Caleb, and finally at the dark shapes waiting in the shadows outside. They broke a reinforced bulkhead, Mike rasped, his voice filled with pure disbelief. Nothing is supposed to break those walls. Corporate contractors cut corners, Mike. You know that, Caleb said, his voice cold and hardened. He didn't look sick anymore, he looked like a man who had just realized his own power. He stood up, his bare feet gripping the cold metal grates. Collins tried to kill us all to save his precious data. Are you still going to protect him? Commander Mike looked down at his ruined armor, then back at the empty, silent corridor of the facility. Collins bypassed security protocols. He left my men to die. As far as I'm concerned, my contract with Apex Biosolutions just expired. Good, Caleb said, a grim, determined smile touching his lips. Get your men to the medical bay. Use the emergency oxygen tanks. I'm going to go have a word with the doctor. Instead of jumping down into the wild ash fields, Caleb turned around and marched straight back into the dark, red-lit corridors of Outpost 44. He didn't carry a gun, and he didn't wear armor. He didn't need to. As he stepped into the hallway, Princess silently vaulted back through the shattered wall, landing beside him without making a sound. Buster, Scrap, and Hazard followed her, their massive, heavy bodies forming a dark, terrifying escort around the young janitor. The pack was moving, and this time, they were hunting. 10 minutes later, inside the primary observation deck, Dr. Collins was packing his things. The room was bright, sterile, and full of expensive holographic computer screens. He was frantically downloading files onto a rugged data tablet, his hands shaking with panic. Stupid, incompetent guards, Collins muttered to himself, grabbing his expensive leather briefcase. The board will understand. A total containment failure requires total sterilization. I will just present the baseline data from the early weeks, crack shatter. The heavy glass viewing window of the command center suddenly exploded inward, raining sharp shards across the pristine white floor tiles. Collins screamed, dropping his briefcase as he fell backward against his desk. Through the ruined window frame, a massive black shape climbed into the room. It was Princess. Her obsidian armor plates flared outward, her mouth unhinging to reveal rows of translucent, razor-sharp teeth. Thick yellow acid dripped from her mandibles, sizzling violently against the expensive computer consoles, sending up sparks and black smoke. Before Collins could even draw a breath to scream again, Buster and Scrap leapt through the opening, cutting off the exit doors. Finally, Caleb stepped through the broken frame, shaking the glass dust from his stained gray uniform. Caleb. Collins gasped, pressing his back hard against the metal desk, his face completely devoid of color. You're alive. This is a medical miracle. The data, shut up, Collins, Caleb said, his voice quiet but incredibly heavy in the tense silence of the room. Princess loomed right behind Caleb, her massive wedge-shaped head hovering over his shoulder, her 4 blue eyes locked onto the scientist's neck. She let out a low, vibrating engine purr, but it wasn't a sound of affection. It was a sound of absolute dominance. This is corporate espionage. Collins stammered, trying to find his old arrogance, though his knees were shaking violently. You are a sanitation worker. You are a janitor. These bioweapons belong to Apex Biosolutions. If you harm me, the company will send a full military division to hunt you down. They aren't bioweapons, Doc. They're a pack, Caleb said, taking a slow step forward. Princess moved with him, matching his pace perfectly. And they don't belong to the company. They belong to whoever feeds them, treats them right, and keeps them warm. Right now, that's me. Caleb walked right up to the desk, leaning down until he was eye to eye with the terrified scientist. You're right about one thing, though, Caleb continued, tapping a dirty finger against Collins's clean white lab coat. The company wants results. They spent billions trying to find a way to control the native fauna of this planet, and they failed. They tried drugs, they tried tracking chips, they tried starvation. All failures. Caleb gestured to the 4 massive, unyielding predators dominating the room. But look at this. A perfect, functioning command structure. They don't attack unless I tell them to. They don't move unless I say so. I am the only asset Apex Biosolutions has that can walk into a room with these things and walk out in one piece. Collins swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the tablet on his desk. His pragmatic, cold corporate brain was already doing the math. Caleb was right. The breakthrough hadn't come from a lab, it had come from a janitor's secret kindness. What? What do you want, Caleb? Collins whispered, his voice trembling. A promotion, Caleb said smoothly, a cynical smile on his face. As of right now, I am no longer a sanitation engineer. I am the lead handler of the Biological Assets Division on Tartarus 9. My salary goes up by 0.5% of the company's gross planetary margin, retroactive to last week. Collins blinked in shock. That is an executive-level salary. Princess let out a sudden, concussive roar right in Collins's face. The force of the sound wave shattering the remaining digital displays in the room and sending a glob of acid sizzling onto his tablet. Agreed. Collins screamed, covering his ears in pure terror. Agreed. Lead handler. I will update the corporate registry immediately. Good executive decision, Doc, Caleb said, patting Collins on the shoulder. He turned around, his bare feet stepping over the shattered glass as he walked toward the exit doors. And my first official order is this: the starvation trials are over. We're moving the pack to the lower hydroponics bay. It's warm, it's large, and you're going to order a double supply of the high-density protein paste. If they get hungry, I might forget to tell them not to eat the scientists. As Caleb walked out into the corridor, Princess, Buster, Scrap, and Hazard fell into a neat, synchronized line behind him. They were an impenetrable shadow of fangs, claws, and black obsidian armor, following their alpha into the dark. Caleb was still wearing a dirty, stained uniform, and his feet were bare, but as he marched down the hallway of Outpost 44, he didn't feel like a corporate slave anymore. He was the king of the monsters, and the galaxy was finally going to listen to his story.